Yeah, it's a Thursday night in February 1950, in Wheeling, West Virginia. You're at a Lincoln Day dinner, one of those Republican Women's Club fundraisers where the chicken's dry, the coffee's weak, and nobody expects to remember anything said after dessert. There are maybe 275 people in the room. Silverware's clinking. Someone's laughing too loud at a joke that wasn't funny. It's cold outside, that bone-deep Appalachian cold that makes your jaw ache. And then this guy stands up. Joseph McCarthy. Junior senator from Wisconsin. 41 years old. Heavy jaw, thick neck, the kind of face that looks like it was carved with a dull axe. Most of his colleagues think he's a joke, loud at parties, sloppy with facts, the kind of guy who embellishes his war record when he's 3 drinks in. Which is often. He's holding a piece of paper. I have here in my hand, he says, and even now, 75 years later, with all the distance and analysis and hindsight we've piled on top of this moment, those 9 words still feel like a pin being pulled from a grenade, a list of 205 names that were made known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party and who nevertheless are still working and shaping policy in the State Department. Somewhere in that room, a fork stops moving. 205 communists. In the government. Right now. Shaping policy while you finish your coffee and button your coat and drive home through the dark. If that makes your skin prickle even a little, stick around, because what happened next should honestly terrify you. Here's the thing that still keeps historians awake: McCarthy didn't need tanks or a coup. He seized power with a speech. With insinuation. With the deeply uncomfortable understanding that in a frightened democracy, the accusation is the conviction. You don't need proof when you've got fear. Just a piece of paper and the balls to wave it. Did he actually have a list? Probably not, or at least not the one he claimed. Within days he'd say 57 names, then 81, then some other number, shifting like he was making it up in real time. Which he was. But here's what makes this moment genuinely chilling: it didn't matter. The number didn't matter. The names didn't matter. What mattered was the gesture. The certainty. The absolute confidence of a man who understood that most people won't fact-check you if you sound sure enough. McCarthy had this quality people noticed, this ability to lie with the serenity of someone who simply doesn't recognize truth as having authority over his will. He'd contradict himself between sentences and dare you to call him on it. Most people didn't. That kind of confidence creates its own gravity. People fall into orbit. And the question this whole ugly story keeps asking, the one that makes everyone squirm no matter where they sit politically, is brutally simple: how easily can a free society be talked into eating itself? Turns out, you don't even need to clear the dessert plates. To understand why that speech detonated like it did, you need to feel the America McCarthy was speaking into. Because he didn't invent the fear. He harvested it. The field was already planted. He just showed up with a scythe. By 1950, the world Americans thought they owned had cracked open. And nobody had a mop. Rewind 5 years. World War II ends. We're the most powerful nation on earth. We've got the bomb, the economy, and, this part matters enormously, the moral high ground. We beat the fascists. Liberated the camps. We're the good guys, full stop, no asterisk. Then, in what felt like a blink, China falls to Mao's communists in October 1949. 400 million people, a quarter of humanity, gone. The question everyone's asking, who lost China, is already loaded with blame. Because surely the greatest nation on earth couldn't just lose. September 1949, the Soviets detonate their first atomic bomb. Years ahead of schedule. The monopoly's over. Our ace in the hole, vaporized. And the obvious explanation, the one that turns out to be partly true, is espionage. Somebody gave them the secrets. Klaus Fuchs, a physicist who worked on the Manhattan Project, confesses in January 1950 to passing nuclear secrets to Moscow. Alger Hiss, State Department golden boy, gets convicted of perjury 11 days before McCarthy's speech. 11 days, you can still smell the ink. So let's be honest about the atmosphere. Completely honest. It wasn't crazy to worry about Soviet spies. There were real spies. Real leaks. Real damage. The Venona decrypts, decoded Soviet cables that wouldn't be declassified until the 90s, would eventually confirm it. Soviet intelligence had penetrated the government. This wasn't paranoid fantasy. Parts of it were documented fact. But here's where myth and reality split like a cracked windshield. The myth, communists everywhere, behind every desk, actively plotting to overthrow the republic, and only vigilant patriots like McCarthy could stop them. The reality, by 1950, most of the actual Soviet networks had already been disrupted. The FBI was investigating. Truman's loyalty program, Executive Order 9835, signed in 1947, was already running. Hundreds of people had been cleared or dismissed. The system was working. Imperfectly, slowly, but working. What McCarthy did was fundamentally different. He weaponized a legitimate concern into a political cudgel. He wasn't hunting spies. He was hunting power. And he found it the way a lot of people find power, by pointing at someone else and screaming, "Be afraid of them." The public, frightened, disoriented, watching their comfortable certainties dissolve, was ready to believe almost anything. Because when people are scared, they don't ask for proof. They ask for someone to blame. That's not an American flaw. That's a human flaw. We're all wired for it. McCarthy just knew where the wires were. The Republican Party, bitter after losing 5 straight presidential elections, looked at McCarthy and thought, useful. The press looked at him and thought, headlines. And McCarthy, with his gambler's instinct and his barroom sense of timing, looked at America and thought, mine for the taking. Nobody in Wheeling understood what they were watching. They clapped politely, finished their coffee, drove home through the cold. Headlights cutting through the dark. But something had shifted. Something ugly had found its voice. And it was just warming up. Here's something genuinely wild, there's no verified recording of the Wheeling speech. None. The local station supposedly broadcast it, but no tape exists. What we have is a version McCarthy stuck into the congressional record days later, and it doesn't match press accounts of what he actually said that night. The most famous political speech of the early Cold War might not say what we think it said. The number on his list? Contested. The Wheeling paper reported 205. McCarthy later claimed 57. Then 81. Then he spent 6 hours on the Senate floor presenting what he called his cases, 6 grinding hours of insinuation and innuendo that proved exactly nothing. Does the number matter? In one sense, not at all. Because McCarthy's genius, if you can stomach calling it that, was never about precision. It was about performance. The piece of paper held high. The jabbing finger. The voice thick with righteous fury. That's stagecraft. He understood, in his bones, that in the emerging television age, the image devours the detail every time. He had this unnerving quality, people who knew him remarked on it, of lying with the calm of someone stating his grocery list. Not nervous. Not defensive. Just, serene. He'd contradict something he'd said 20 minutes earlier and stare you down. Most people blinked first. Within days of Wheeling, McCarthy repeated his charges in Salt Lake City, then Reno. Each time, the details shifted like sand. Each time, the press covered it. Each time, the Truman White House pushed back, but pushing back against McCarthy was like punching fog. He'd just change the claim and attack whoever was doing the punching. The Senate, alarmed enough to respond, created the Tidings Committee to investigate. Chaired by Maryland Democrat Millard Tidings, a 4-term incumbent who'd served since 1927. And here's where you see the turning point harden into something permanent. The Tidings Committee investigated for months. Heard testimony. Reviewed files. And concluded, explicitly, formally, that McCarthy's claims were a fraud and a hoax perpetrated on the Senate of the United States and the American people. A fraud. A hoax. Not unsubstantiated. Not inconclusive. Those are the committee's actual words. It should have been over. In any rational system, being formally declared a fraud by a Senate investigation ends your career. You slink home, practice law, maybe run for county judge if people forget. Instead, it supercharged him. McCarthy attacked the committee itself. Called it a whitewash. Accused Tidings of protecting communists. Then, and this is where real darkness seeps in, he went after Tidings personally. His allies produced a doctored photograph showing Tidings seemingly chatting warmly with Earl Browder, head of the American Communist Party. Total fabrication. 2 photos spliced together with scissors and glue. A proto-deepfake made with kindergarten tools. Tidings lost his re-election bid. 23 years in the Senate. Erased by a fake photograph and whispers. And suddenly, like cold wine through every office on the Hill, every politician in America understood the message. Cross McCarthy, and he destroys you. Not with evidence. Not with argument. With spectacle and the public's appetite for believing the worst. The turning point wasn't the speech. It was the moment Washington realized nobody was going to stop him. And that maybe nobody wanted to, because stopping him meant becoming his next target. That's the sound of democracy flinching. What followed was a slow-motion avalanche. And the thing about avalanches, by the time you hear the rumble, you're already under the snow. From 1950 to 1954, McCarthy became arguably the most powerful man in Washington. Not through legislation, he passed virtually nothing. Not by catching spies, he caught none. His power was purely destructive. The power to name. To accuse. To summon you before cameras and ask, with manufactured gravity, are you now, or have you ever been? When Republicans won the Senate in 1952, McCarthy became chairman of the Government Operations Committee. He had subpoena power now. Staff. Budgets. The ability to drag anyone before the cameras and make them explain themselves under oath. The targets kept expanding, the way these things always do. Voice of America employees. Then librarians, yes, librarians, whose overseas reading rooms contained books by authors McCarthy deemed suspicious. His chief counsel Roy Cohn, 26 years old and already radiating malevolence, and Cohn's companion David Schein took a bizarre tour of U.S. Information Agency libraries in Europe, pulling books like Health Inspectors Finding Rats. Some of those books were burned. Not metaphorically. Burned. In America. In the 1950s. Eisenhower gave a speech at Dartmouth warning against it, don't join the book burners. But he wouldn't name McCarthy. Even the courage was careful. McCarthy went after the army. Universities. Journalists who challenged him. Anyone who looked sideways at his methods. The immediate fallout was institutional paralysis. A cognitive lockjaw that spread through government. The State Department, already shaken, became terrified of its own shadow. Career diplomats who were genuine experts on China, people who'd spent decades learning the language, understanding the politics, were purged or silenced because they'd accurately reported that Chiang Kai-shek's government was corrupt and losing. Their crime? Being right about something you weren't allowed to be right about. Many historians draw a direct line between the loss of that Asia expertise and America's catastrophic misunderstanding of Southeast Asia. Think about that chain. A chicken dinner speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, contributing to a war that killed 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese. Sounds absurd. But the thread's there if you follow it. The Truman administration, rather than confronting McCarthy head-on, often tried to out-tough him, expanding loyalty programs, refusing to share files, which only made it look like they were hiding something. Eisenhower, the war hero who liberated Europe, privately despised McCarthy but publicly refused to engage. "I won't get in the gutter with that guy," he reportedly said. Which sounds principled until you realize it also sounds like an excuse. Here's the defining image of the era, not one hearing, but the atmosphere. The suffocating sense that anyone could be accused, anytime, for any association. A book you read. A meeting you attended in college. A petition you signed in 1938 when the Soviets were still allies against Hitler. The past became a minefield. McCarthy had the only map. People stopped speaking freely. That's the collapse. Not buildings falling. Not government overthrown. Not tanks. Just silence. The slow, creeping silence of a society afraid to think out loud. The empty chair at the faculty meeting. The phone call not returned. The old friend who crosses the street. That kind of silence has a sound, if you listen. It sounds like democracy holding its breath. Numbers are useful for historians. But this part's about faces. Consider Annie Lee Moss. A black woman working as a clerk at the Pentagon's Army Signal Corps. Not a policymaker. Not a strategist. A woman who handled routing slips and paper. McCarthy hauled her before his subcommittee in early 1954. Accused her of being a Communist Party member. Grilled her on live television. She sat there, bewildered. Middle-aged, hands clasped tight, clearly terrified. Said she didn't really know what communism was. Never been to a meeting. Her voice shaking but holding. Whether she'd ever actually been listed in party records remains murky. Some evidence suggests possible nominal membership years earlier, some suggests mistaken identity, a different Annie Lee Moss in a different city. The truth may never untangle. But the spectacle, a senator publicly interrogating a low-level clerk, treating her like a mortal threat while she sat under those lights trying not to cry, became one of the iconic images of the era's cruelty. Senator Stuart Symington finally leaned into his microphone. "I believe you're telling the truth." You can hear the disgust in his voice, even on old recordings. Or consider the Hollywood 10, screenwriters and directors blacklisted starting in 1947. Different committee, whack, not McCarthy's, but the same ecosystem of fear breathing through different mouths. They lost their livelihoods. Some lost marriages. Some drank themselves quiet. Dalton Trumbo, one of the most talented screenwriters of his generation, the man who wrote Roman Holiday, who wrote Spartacus, spent years writing under pseudonyms for a fraction of his pay. He won an Oscar for The Brave One in 1957 and couldn't walk on stage. Someone else picked up the statue. Your best work, and you can't put your name on it. Your best work belongs to a ghost. There were suicides. Philip Loeb, an actor blacklisted from the Goldbergs, took an overdose in a Manhattan hotel in 1955. He was 62. Herbert Norman, Canadian ambassador to Egypt, jumped from a Cairo apartment building in 1957 after McCarthy-aligned investigators renewed allegations. He left a note. People who read it said it was calm, precise, and devastated. These aren't abstractions. These are people who decided death was preferable to the daily grind of public suspicion. The unending humiliation of being guilty of something they couldn't identify, by people who couldn't prove it. Then there's the broader damage. The kind without names. Teachers who quietly stopped assigning certain books. Scientists who skipped conferences. Government employees who broke off friendships because friendship itself had become evidence. Loyalty oaths spread everywhere. State governments. Universities. Private companies. In some states, you couldn't get a fishing license without signing one. A fishing license. You had to swear you weren't a communist to catch trout. I wish I were making that up. Here's the question worth sitting with: how many brilliant people never contributed what they could have because they were too afraid? How many scientific papers went unwritten? How many policy alternatives were never proposed because proposing them might sound sympathetic to the wrong side? We'll never know. And that's part of the cost too. The invisible part. The phantom limb of a culture that amputated its own curiosity. The things that never happened because fear got there first. So who was responsible? Not the textbook answer. The honest, messy, uncomfortable one. McCarthy himself, obviously. The engine, the face, the sweat-soaked fury. His willingness to lie, fabricate, bully, that's on him. He treated truth like a parking meter. Something you deal with if you have to, ignore if you can. There's no generous reading of Joseph McCarthy. He wasn't a patriot who went too far. He was a demagogue who found a vehicle and drove it until the wheels came off. But, here comes the uncomfortable part, McCarthy didn't operate in a vacuum. He was enabled. Consistently. Knowingly. By people who understood exactly what he was and decided he was useful anyway. Republican leadership saw him as a weapon against Democrats and chose to aim him rather than disarm him. Robert Taft, Mr. Republican, reportedly told McCarthy to keep swinging, if one charge doesn't stick, try another. That's not patriotism. That's cynicism in a flag. The press amplified McCarthy enormously through what we'd now call both sidesing. If a senator said something, you reported it. Senator McCarthy today alleged, no context. No pushback. No fact check in the same paragraph. Just the allegation, printed above the fold, across the country. The press didn't create McCarthy. But it gave him oxygen. Buckets of it. Some journalists fought back. Edward R. Murrow. Drew Pearson. Herblock, who actually coined the term McCarthyism. But they were exceptions. And even Murrow waited until 1954, 4 years in, to make his famous broadcast. 4 years of silence before courage. J. Edgar Hoover had a cozy, deniable relationship with McCarthy. Fed information through back channels. Not always directly, not always with paper trails, but the pipeline existed. Both men knew it. Hoover had his own anti-communist crusade running for decades, and McCarthy's theatrics served Hoover's agenda. Useful idiots are still useful. The Truman and Eisenhower administrations both failed. Truman's loyalty program, designed to inoculate against being called soft on communism, ended up legitimizing the very framework McCarthy exploited. If the president says we need to investigate loyalty, McCarthy can say, see? Even he admits the government's riddled with subversives. Eisenhower's strategy, dignified avoidance, hoping McCarthy would burn out, was arguably worse. It looked like cowardice. Honestly, it kind of was. The most respected military leader in the Western world couldn't bring himself to challenge a junior senator who'd been in office 4 years. That tells you something about the power of the moment. Or about Eisenhower. Maybe both. And then there's the public. In January 1954, at McCarthy's absolute peak, his approval rating hovered around 50%. Half the country, that's not fringe. That's not lunatic margin. That's mainstream America saying, yeah, this seems about right. So who's to blame? Everyone who let it happen. Everyone who calculated that silence was safer than speaking up. Everyone who decided their career, their comfort, their standing mattered more than somebody else's rights. McCarthy was the match. But the kindling was everywhere. And a lot of people watched the flames and chose not to reach for the extinguisher. McCarthyism wasn't just about communism. It was about conformity. About the borders of acceptable thought. And the line between national security and political repression was never clearly drawn, and here's the thing, by design. The ambiguity was the feature. Think about who got targeted. Not generals. Not CEOs. Labor organizers. Civil rights activists. Teachers. Writers. Artists. And, running like a dark current alongside the Red Scare, gay men and lesbians. The Lavender Scare is one of the least discussed, most devastating chapters. It ran parallel to McCarthy's hunt, sometimes intertwined, and in many ways was more merciless. The State Department fired more employees for being homosexual than for being communist. More. The logic, twisted, but internally consistent the way cruel systems always are, was that homosexuals were security risks because they could be blackmailed. Blackmailed by whom? By a society that would punish them for being who they were. The cruelty creates the vulnerability, then the vulnerability justifies more cruelty. It's a closed loop. A trap with no exit, by design. McCarthy himself never led the Lavender Scare, that was driven by figures like Senator Kenneth Wherry and the broader security state. But his project of paranoia made it possible. Made it permissible. Made it normal. When you create a culture where any deviation from mainstream is suspect, every kind of deviation becomes dangerous. Political. Sexual. Intellectual. The categories blur. And that's the point. There's bitter irony here. Roy Cohn, McCarthy's chief counsel, his most vicious attack dog, Cohn was a closeted gay man. He'd die of AIDS in 1986 while publicly insisting it was liver cancer. He destroyed gay government employees while hiding behind the same machinery of persecution. I'm not sure there's a more compact symbol of McCarthyism's hypocrisy. Here's what connects to the present moment. McCarthyism proved you don't need to suspend democracy to undermine it. You can use democratic institutions, committees, subpoenas, hearings, elections, the free press, to do profoundly anti-democratic things. McCarthy was never a dictator. He was a senator. He held hearings. Gave speeches. Won elections. Everything he did was technically within the system. That's what should keep you up at night. The system, by itself, isn't enough. The Constitution's just paper, like McCarthy's list. It only means something if people defend it, even when defending it costs them. After September 11th, the Patriot Act, warrantless surveillance, black sites, a global detention system operating in legal darkness. Today, algorithms deciding who's a threat before crimes are committed. Content moderation functioning as speech codes. Social credit systems. Watch lists compiled by machines no human reviews. Technology changes every decade. The tension between security and liberty doesn't change at all. Just puts on different clothes. Here's the most uncomfortable question: was McCarthy completely wrong? The Venona decrypts confirmed Soviet espionage. There were communists in government. The threat was real. But, and this distinction is the entire moral architecture, being right about a problem doesn't justify any method of addressing it. A doctor who correctly diagnoses cancer but treats it by setting the patient on fire hasn't saved anyone. Soviet spies existing didn't justify destroying innocent lives, gutting due process, or turning the Bill of Rights into a suggestion suspended whenever convenient. That distinction, between real problem and legitimate response, is where McCarthyism collapsed morally. And it's where democracies keep collapsing, over and over, every time fear sprints ahead of reason and nobody calls it back. And here's where the modern peace gets genuinely strange. Picture a hearing room. Could be Congress, could be anywhere. There's a witness at a table, hands flat, microphone in front of them. On a screen behind the committee chair, a video. Crystal clear. High definition. Completely convincing. Showing that witness at a meeting they never attended, shaking hands with someone they've never met, saying words they never spoke. Fabricated from the first pixel to the last. And perfect. Indistinguishable from reality. Not to the eye, not to casual analysis, not to the 14 million people who've already watched it before the witness sits down. That's McCarthyism upgraded for AI. And it's not science fiction. Every component exists right now. McCarthy had a piece of paper nobody could read and a doctored photo made with scissors. That was enough to destroy careers in 1950. Now imagine those tools superhuman. Deepfake videos of targets at rallies that never happened. AI-generated documents, aged and distressed, proving membership in banned organizations. Voice clones delivering fabricated confessions. Algorithms that don't just spread the lie but optimize it, testing which version gets the most engagement, amplifying that automatically, at scale, in real time. None of this requires government. A motivated individual with a laptop and $200 in cloud credits could build a McCarthy-level smear over a long weekend. But here's the specific problem that connects most directly: algorithmic guilt by association. Modern data analysis maps your entire social graph. Who you follow. Who you email. What events you've attended. What you've read, bookmarked, lingered on. In a McCarthyist framework, that data doesn't inform. It indicts. Attended a protest. Connected. Follow a certain journalist. Sympathizer. Read an article about a forbidden idea. Now you're on a list that nobody told you exists, maintained by a system nobody elected. The difference between 1950 and now isn't just speed. It's scale. McCarthy went name by name. A surveillance system powered by machine learning flags millions simultaneously, ranks them by risk score, does it without a single conscious human decision. The list writes itself. And never stops writing. The counterpoint matters: AI also makes lying harder in some ways. McCarthy thrived because fact-checking was glacial, information controlled by a handful of outlets. Most Americans couldn't access primary sources. Today, someone can debunk a false claim in minutes and share it with millions. The tidings photograph could be identified as fake by a high schooler with basic tools in under a minute. The tools for deception are more powerful than ever. So are the tools for truth. The question, echoing forward from 1950 like a bell that won't stop, is which tools we decide to trust. Whether we have patience, in a world of infinite noise, to insist on verification before we let accusation become verdict. Back to that hearing room. The video on the screen. The witness at the table. Who checks whether it's real? And more importantly, does anyone in the room actually want to know? How do we remember McCarthyism? Depends who you ask, when you ask, and increasingly, what platform they're standing on. The dominant narrative, textbooks, documentaries, prestige films, goes like this: McCarthyism was shameful. A witch hunt. A cautionary tale about fear overriding freedom. Edward R. Murrow's See It Now broadcast confronting McCarthy in March 1954 is treated as journalistic masterpiece. The Army McCarthy hearings, where Boston attorney Joseph Welch delivered the line, "Have you no sense of decency, sir, at long last?" framed as the moment America woke up and shook off the fever. That narrative's mostly right. But also suspiciously tidy. The kind of story a country tells itself because the alternative, admitting the fever never fully broke, is too frightening. There's a counter-narrative. Never fully went away. Just went underground and resurfaced, the way these things do. The argument, advanced by conservative commentators and historians, most notably M. Stanton Evans in Blacklisted by History, 2007, is that McCarthy was substantially correct. Communist infiltration was real, extensive, deliberately covered up by a liberal establishment with too many skeletons to allow full investigation. In this telling, McCarthy was a flawed messenger of vital truth, and the real scandal was infiltration, not investigation. The Venona evidence complicates things. Some of McCarthy's targets were indeed connected to Soviet intelligence. But many, most, were not. And McCarthy never seemed to know the difference. Or care. He threw accusations like a drunk throws darts. Occasionally hitting the board, mostly hitting the wall, sometimes hitting bystanders. Claiming bullseye every time. Internationally, Americans tend to forget this. McCarthyism has been used as Exhibit A of American hypocrisy. During the Cold War, Soviet propaganda relentlessly cited it to neutralize American criticism of the Gulag, political prisoners, suppression of dissent. Honestly, it was effective. Hard to lecture about freedom when you've got blacklists in your pocket. In Hollywood, the blacklist became almost mythological. A founding trauma of the modern industry. Films like The Front, 1976, Good Night, and Good Luck, 2005, Trumbo, 2015, kept the story alive, generally presenting it as courageous artists versus paranoid politicians. But even these simplify. They focus on sympathetic victims, dramatic confrontations, clear villains. The murkier cases, people who actually were party members, who did attend meetings, who genuinely believed in some version of communism, get smoothed over. Ambiguity makes awkward screenwriting. Social media added an entirely new, genuinely chaotic layer. The word McCarthyism gets deployed roughly 800 times a day on the internet. By the left against the right. By the right against the left. By libertarians against everyone. By everyone against Silicon Valley. Cancel culture is McCarthyism. Congressional investigations are McCarthyism. Getting ratioed is basically McCarthyism. Everything is McCarthyism. Nothing is. And that might be the strangest twist. McCarthy's name has itself become an accusation, a label you slap on opponents to delegitimize them without engaging their argument. Which is, when you think about it, a profoundly McCarthyist thing to do with McCarthy's memory. The man's legacy weaponized using his own methods. He'd probably appreciate the irony. If he appreciated irony. Which, from everything I've read, he did not. The real danger of reducing McCarthyism to slogan is that it empties the word of meaning. If everything is McCarthyism, then nothing is. And when the real thing shows up again, when someone actually does weaponize accusation against due process, exploit fear for power, build a machine that destroys people based on suspicion rather than evidence, we might not recognize it. Because we used up the word arguing about podcast hosts and Netflix shows. And by then, the list's already written. Nobody thought to ask what was on it. McCarthy himself came to a miserable end. Cramped. Bitter. Alone in the ways that matter. After the Army McCarthy hearings in spring 1954 exposed his bullying on live television, the first time most Americans actually saw him operate in real time, unedited, for hours, public opinion turned like a ship in a storm. He looked small on camera. Petulant. Mean in a way that wasn't commanding. Just ugly. The Senate censured him in December 1954. Vote of 67 to 22. He didn't lose his seat, but he lost his power. And for McCarthy, a man whose entire identity was dominance and attack, losing power was losing everything. He drank more. Openly now. His face bloated. He showed up to the floor looking disoriented. Colleagues who'd courted him crossed corridors to avoid him. He died May 2, 1957. 48 years old. Acute hepatitis, almost certainly exacerbated by alcoholism everyone had known about and nobody had confronted. The Senate held a brief moment of silence. Then moved on to other business. But the ideas didn't die in that hospital bed. The playbook survived. It's dog-eared, well-thumbed, sitting on a shelf somewhere, waiting for the next person who figures out that fear is the cheapest form of political currency. High return, low investment. Someone else always pays the price. What haunts people about this story, what makes it impossible to file away as history and move on, is how easily it happened. Not through force. Not through tanks or coups. Through speeches. Insinuation. A functioning democracy using its own institutions to devour itself. The only defense that's ever actually worked, in any era, against any version of this, isn't a law. Isn't an institution. Isn't an algorithm or constitutional amendment. It's the willingness of individual people to say, even when it costs them, even when the room goes cold and everyone stares. Show me the evidence. 3 words. That's the whole firewall. But you have to say them out loud. So here's where we land. No clean resolution. No moment where the music swells and you feel okay about everything. The central question isn't really about McCarthy. Not ultimately. It's about us. What a society does when genuinely frightened. Whether institutions built to protect freedom can be turned, legally, procedurally, paperwork filed correctly, into instruments of oppression. And whether ordinary people, not heroes, just people paying mortgages and trying not to get noticed, have courage, when it matters, to say no when every incentive screams yes, or safer still, nothing. Let me frame it directly. Is it ever justified to sacrifice individual rights for collective security? The yes argument is straightforward and, I want to be fair, not insane. The Soviet Union was a genuine existential threat. Nuclear weapons. Massive military. Global espionage network. Explicitly stated goal of worldwide revolution. Some people McCarthy targeted actually were Soviet agents. In a world where one piece of classified information could shift the nuclear balance, where one spy in the right place could cost millions of lives, maybe a more aggressive approach to internal security was warranted. Even if some innocent people got swept up. Even if rights got dented. The alternative, missing a real threat because you were too fastidious about procedure, could be measured in megatons. That's real. You can't wave it away. That no argument is also real. And I think ultimately more persuasive. The point isn't that there were no Soviet spies. There were. The point is McCarthyism didn't actually address the threat. Didn't catch spies. The FBI and professional counterintelligence did that, painstaking, unglamorous work McCarthy never contributed to and sometimes actively undermined by tipping off targets with public grandstanding. What McCarthyism did, terrorized the innocent, silenced dissent across a generation, destroyed institutional expertise the country desperately needed, corroded the democratic values that made the thing being defended worth defending. If you protect freedom by gutting freedom, what exactly have you saved? A flag? A border? An anthem? You've defended an empty building and called it victory. This question's eternal. After September 11th, Patriot Act, warrantless surveillance, extraordinary rendition, black sites, global detention operating in legal darkness. Today, algorithms deciding who's a threat before crimes are committed. Content moderation as speech code. Social credit. Watch lists compiled by machine learning, no human reviews. Technology changes every decade. The tension between security and liberty doesn't. I started by asking how easily a free society can be talked into destroying itself. The answer's terrifying, easily. All it takes is a real threat, a willing demagogue, a press that reports accusations louder than rebuttals, an establishment too comfortable or cowardly to intervene, and a public too frightened to demand proof before punishment. Here's what haunts me about Wheeling, West Virginia. February 9, 1950. A man stands with a piece of paper. Says it contains 205 names. Nobody asks to see it. Nobody walks to the podium and says, "May I read that, Senator?" Nobody demands proof. Not that night. Not that week. Not for years. 275 people in a room. Not one raised a hand. That silence is the whole story. Don't be the room that doesn't raise its hand. If this made you think, genuinely think, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because history doesn't repeat itself. But it rhymes like it's trying to warn us, ****.